Hello again, witches, seekers, and friends, and welcome to the FAT Feminist Witch podcast, the show where we do a little ranting, raving, and wand waving. I'm your host, Paige Vanderbeck, and together we're going to explore magic and spirituality, social justice, the psychic realm, and truly modern witchcraft. Hello witches, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm not alone in this episode. I've got Cory Hutcheson from New World Witchery podcast and the author of a fabulous book by the same name with me today talking about North American folk magic. This is really exciting. I absolutely love folk stories and magic, and ones that are, truly homegrown tend to be some of my favorites. So Cory and I are talking about his book and folk magic naturally, but I also share a story I found in a local to me, which is Windsor, Ontario, French-Canadian newspaper about a family driven out of town after being accused of witchcraft in the 1880s. I didn't think that still happened in the 1880s. Cory actually helps me put a few of the pieces of the puzzle together and gives me tips on finding more info, so stay tuned for that in the second half of the episode. Before we jump on with Cory, let me tell you a little bit about New World Witchery, the book. This is absolutely a 5 crystal ball rated book. Not only is it huge, it's so big, because North America, we have so much more magic and even just, folk history here than I think people realize. But the entire tone and voice of the book is really warm and funny and engaging. Just like Cory, you'll hear him. Every single chapter was interesting. It was full of stories and history, and also real practical magic that you can do for yourself. Practical might not be the word, but it's real magic that you can do, with your hands. So there are little sections like Dirt Under the Nails that gives you some old folk magic experiments and spells to try for yourself. And then you have these Singing Bones sections that tell you about real figures in the history of our folklore here, like Zora Neale Hurston. The topic of cultural appropriation, even just within the realm of witchcraft, is one that we're all thinking and talking about more lately as the years go on. When you're writing about the folk practices of a place like North America, which is filled with, all sorts of different cultures because of a history of colonialism, it's really easy to swerve right out of your own lane. Really easy. Cory's a white guy, and the magic of Black people and practitioners comes up a lot in the history of the magic of North America. But there's never a moment in the book where he claims any sort of space within a tradition like hoodoo. Not only did he approach, the topic with respect, but he never once downplayed the impact of African American people on the magic of, this entire continent all over the place. Likewise, he gave credit to the many native and indigenous tribes of the continent and their places in the stories. And whenever he felt like his access to information was lacking, he said so. At one point, he says he is not as familiar with Asian American folklore and folk magic. And so he won't go into it quite as much as some of the others, but that's the reason. This is great. You don't have to know everything, guys. It's okay to say, I don't know very much about this. I'm really excited to learn, but I can't really be an expert on that. So if you're wondering if that's a topic that came up in the book, yes, it is. One of my favorite features of the book, because I am an absolute nerd, is that Cory gives you so many resources. So many resources for you to look up later if you want to keep digging. Not only is there this, big old bibliography in the back of the book, but every chapter ends with a few recommended books, and he tells you why he recommends them. That's the best. I love that. Thanks to, those recommendations and links, I've actually found a whole bunch of Canadian folklore, kind of specifically, I've followed the trail. And I've had a lot of fun reading it, and I'm learning a lot about, my country and how different the folklore is from province to province. Super cool. I think this book is especially really great right now. The stories are so entertaining. The book is kind of hard to put down because it's fun to read. And a lot of the rituals are very hands-on and active. Some of them are even a little wacky or experimental, which I like. And it kind of helped shake me out of the COVID funk just a little bit as far as magic is concerned. And it could save your life. It may be the perfect plague preparation manual. So in chapter 11, Roots, Stones, and Bones, Cory gives us a recipe for 4 thieves' vinegar and tells us a little bit about it. Listen to this. Supposedly, the legend is that sometime during the plague years of the 16th and 17th centuries, a story went about that 4 spice merchants had discovered a secret formula which made them immune to the plague, and which they'd rub on their bodies before robbing corpses ravaged by the disease. 4 Thieves vinegar is still a popular magical formula with benefits that range from keeping away illness to breaking hexes and even being used to lay a curse now and then. Here is a version of the recipe based on one that I learned with a few minor modifications of my own. So, here are your ingredients and method for 4 Thieves vinegar. 1 pint mason jar filled to just about 3/4 full with good cider vinegar. 1 head of garlic peeled to skins, around 8 to 12 cloves. 1 large handful of red chili flakes. 1 large handful of black mustard seeds. If you can't find black mustard, yellow will be fine, though you may want to toast them to release some of their oils and blacken them a bit. 1 handful of salt, kosher or sea salt are best. Optional ingredients include a sprig of rue. I usually include this. Sorry, that was in parentheses. Cory says he usually includes this. Love that. I love rue. Black peppercorns, just a small handful of these. Rosemary, other types of chilies such as habanero or jalapeno. Guinea pepper grains, galangal root, ginger root, or any of these to boost the overall strength of the mix. And you can see that they're kind of spicy ingredients, right? Put your ingredients into a mason jar, making sure it doesn't overflow. Cap and seal, then shake vigorously for 30 to 60 seconds. Put it in a cool, dark place or a refrigerator. Shake daily for 2 weeks, then keep stored in a dark pantry or fridge. The way I was taught to make this follows the rule that the recipe should be not only strong, but edible. It should, in fact, make quite a tasty addition to an oil and vinegar salad dressing, with the added bonus of keeping you free from any hexes, curses, or bad luck. Isn't that wonderful? So, want to help yourself during this plague that we're living through? Make yourself some 4 Thieves vinegar. Now, before I get in trouble, I am not saying that 4 Thieves vinegar will cure or kill or do literally anything to the coronavirus. So please don't take that seriously and get vaccinated. I actually just got my first shot of the vaccine. Pretty exciting. Just in case, I don't want any of you to trust it and get hurt. So I highly recommend checking out New World Witchery. But if you're still not convinced, I am positive that this great interview with Cory Hutcheson will change your mind. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show. I'm so excited to have like a fun book of folk magic that is also a practical book on magic to talk about on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. And I love, like I was saying earlier, I really love, you have been making many more forays into folk magic lately. And I love that. I love how into that you're getting, and hopefully you're getting other people into it too. So
yeah, I hope so. I know when I was researching my own book, I kept thinking, make sure you tell people to go where they are, to ask people where they live, to look at the weird mythology and legends where they live, and not to just get hung up on the cool stuff that you can see in books, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I hope people get that message, because I think that's where the really interesting stuff is.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think it can be really easy for people to think folk magic, that there is folk magic, but I don't have it. It's not near me, and I have no, it's this other thing, and that they'll look at hoodoo, for example, right? And they'll say, oh, hoodoo is folk magic. I can go do hoodoo, and they have absolutely no connection to the culture.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of say, well, wait. Have you looked in your own backyard first? Because there's probably lots of folk magic that you could get into. You
Absolutely.
Just have to know where to poke and what questions to ask.
Yeah, actually, I really loved right near the beginning when you were defining different types of folk magic, I
Mm-hmm.
loved the distinction you made between hoodoo and Southern conjure, where hoodoo
Mm-hmm.
is, specifically African American, Black in origin
Mm-hmm.
and in general practice. Man, you nailed it. This has been this has been like a contentious, like semantic discussion on on witch Twitter for so long now.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and it just, this is a fantastic way to describe it, because I see lots of what looks like hoodoo where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it is practiced by African American people, but a lot of it is not. And it's just, you can see a difference. There's a
Mm-hmm.
difference in how they practice and the things they use.
Yeah, there really is, and then and there's places where each of these traditions can bleed into one another, and they do share and exchange information.
Oh yeah.
But for me, and I mean, I benefit from the fact that I have also been watching the cataclysmic implosion, explosion of these terms over and over again for the past 10
Yeah.
years. But so much of it is really coming down to like there's been a real co-opting of African American spiritual tradition, and if I'm being perfectly honest, our show contributed to that for at least a little bit, just because we were kind of ignorant of some of the things that we were doing, and I don't regret like necessarily bringing some of that information to the forefront, but I certainly wish we had been more. We'd been making more of an effort to bring more people of color on the show, right?
Yeah.
And have those discussions a little more. And I think in the past half decade, we've improved that. We've had more people of color on the show and really kind of talked through some of these issues. But there really is, I mean, there really was this kind of difficulty with sort of defining these terms. But when you kind of look at Southern Conjure and say, oh, okay, so there's a lot of the sort of Irish, German
Hmm.
traditions that wind up there. And yes, there's some African American and Native traditions, indigenous traditions that are getting absorbed too. And that becomes its own thing. And yes, it's kind of connected to hoodoo, and there are some places where it bleeds over and crosses over. But hoodoo is so specifically African American. Root
Yeah.
work, very similarly, very much an African American
Yeah.
approach, but from a different area.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. And I love seeing, the distinctions, because I love seeing, all the different types of magic.
yeah,
It's one thing that I love the most about studying magic, right? How
yeah,
different it all is. So New World Witchery, your podcast, how long have you guys been doing that now?
about 11 years. Yeah, 11 and a half
Oh,
years. Yeah, for a minute,
wow.
hot minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, a hot minute. Oh my goodness, you're right. I think the first time I listened was 2011. So, oh my
Yep.
goodness, that was 10 years ago.
Hmm.
Wow, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
That caught me off guard a little bit. That
Yep.
is so exciting, so cool. I'm so glad you guys are still going.
Thanks. We are too.
Yeah. And I definitely relate to this idea that in the beginning of your podcasting, you maybe weren't so aware of some of the cultural appropriation that you had
Hmm.
been, unknowingly taken part in.
Right.
Is
Hmm.
that something that you thought about in your book a little bit? Like, I want to make sure to address a few things that I was confused about, or that I had to learn along the way.
Very much, yes. And I mean, even in kind of the early chapters, I tried to sort of address this issue of appropriation versus. I think there are places where you can have cultural exchange without appropriation, and where you can have cultural interchange. And importantly, there's also situations where people can learn about each other's culture without necessarily co-opting it or taking it. And I think that's very
Absolutely, yeah.
difficult. Frankly, I think it's very difficult for a lot of us who are white to hear something is off limits.
Yes.
And so understanding, like, yes, learning about these things. And I tried to, within the book, to stick to mostly very public sources, and as often as possible refer to Black scholars like Katrina Hazard Donald, or Lilith Dorsey or Alba Rebato, and some of these African American scholars who have put this effort into exploring this material. So that's what's in the book, and then you can go and actually dig in deeper with those scholars, and then also talk to actual practitioners within those communities if you're interested in knowing more, but not necessarily presenting anything that's sort of secret or guarded or closed.
Right.
Because I don't have that authority to do that. I don't have the permission to do that.
Yeah.
So and I try to do that with most of the traditions that I'm not actively a part of, and then to sort of present my own sort of personal interpretation of something that works within the folk magic that I do, that sort of demonstrates some of that, some of the basic ideas that are found throughout these traditions. But yeah, there really is this thing where, you know, we talk about all the time, if you know better, you do better.
Yeah.
And the book presented an opportunity for me to do that and helped to sort of recorrect the course of some of the things that we, you know, messed up on in the first part of our show. And I think we've done a good job of kind of bouncing back from that, but we still have work to do. And even in this book, I've, you know, reading through it, you know how a book is. You write it, it takes a year to publish it, sometimes longer.
Yeah.
And even now I kind of look back and I'm like, oh, you know, if I were revising it, I probably would say that just a little differently. So,
I know I have to actively keep myself from like editing the book when I when I look through it to reread it. I'm like, don't do that page. Don't grab that red pen, like just circling things. Or like trying to share a quote. And I'm like, can I just like rewrite this quote? And I'm like, no.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it was, there was a poet, I think it was W.H. Auden, who like literally like, his publishers would be like basically trying to pull the paper out of his hands as he's still trying to do He's like, no, we're publishing that. He's like, no, I can still change it.
Oh my goodness. That's that's me. I have to force myself to like put it away so I can't look at it. Yeah,
exactly.
That's so funny. Yeah, this is your first book. So New World Witchery, Folk Magic in North America. This is your first book. This is so exciting. Are you very excited?
I am a little daunted. It's funny because it's, I mean, you've seen the file, and hopefully before the episode comes out, you'll actually get to hold this 2-pound book in your hand. But at the same time, like, this was a lot of material, and it was really funny. Like, I went into this with the expectation. I sort of said to my publisher, "Look, this is going to be a 150,000 word book," and the publisher was like, "No, I don't think it is. Can we shave that a little?" And so we went through a process to figure that out. But then I still wound up writing like 150, 160,000 words and having to trim stuff out of it. So I have a whole like file of another 40,000 words that never made it into the book.
Yeah, even the digital file is like massive. Like
it's really big.
When I loaded it on the tablet, I'm like, oh my, okay. I started like scrolling through. Cool.
Like, that's taken a minute to download. What in the world?
Yeah. It's a huge book, but you know what? It's interesting. It moves really well. You know, you're not focusing on one particular story for way too long, and you're still giving me enough to kind of get me obsessed with some of these stories. So, yeah, I think you, despite it being humongous, I think it's exactly as big as it needs to be.
Oh, thank you. Have you bumped into any favorite, favorite witches or favorite stories yet that you really enjoyed?
Oh my God, I think I just had it open. It was such a tiny thing, but I laughed so hard at how it's in the curse chapter. Of course it is.
Of course.
Because those are just super fun, right? But it was just the most like witty and hilarious curse that I've ever read in my life. Oh, I knew I wrote it down. Come on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on
the curse to constantly remember a hilarious story and want to share a joke about it, but then always forgetting it by the time they find someone to tell it to.
Yes. That's the boatman's the guy who's like, he's running a little skiff out in the harbor, and they're making fun of his boat, right?
Yeah. Oh my God.
He turns around, he's like, "You're making fun of my boat. Okay, fine. You're gonna remember the story and laugh about it, but you can never tell it to anybody."
It's the funniest joke that you will never be able to tell. I laughed so hard. I'm like, that's like, may you always, stub your toe in the middle of the night type curses. I love that. It's nice and petty.
Yes. It's the like, may your socks always be wet kind of a curse.
Oh, gross,
like,
right?
I hate it so much.
That was so fun. Your book is so fun. I really, like I said, it's really long, but I really enjoyed it all the way through. I love how, gosh, what was I going to say? First of all, you're kind of my like nerdy kindred spirit. Like I keep making making notes. Like, look at these, Terry Pratchett-esque footnotes. So thank you for that, by the way.
Thanks.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your part of North America and some of
Mhm.
the folk magic where you are. So whereabouts are you in America exactly?
Well, so I grew up in the South, so a lot of my
Cool.
framework for folk magic is the South. But I currently live in what would be called kind of Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania German country. So there's
Interesting.
a lot of influences there that I've spent the past half decade kind of imbibing. And I wouldn't consider myself an authority on any of those specifically either. I happen to have more contact with those than with some traditions, but they are still. I don't want to say they're closed because they're that this part of the country they're not particularly closed about it, but they are
Yeah.
there. There may not be a wall, but there's definitely a fence. So, so you do have to do a little bit of work to kind of get to know people. But that being said, like, so there's a couple different versions of magic that I've kind of bumped into sort of throughout my life, but most within sort of my framework of practice, it's very much Southern conjure is what I've kind of grown up with and around and doing. So.
Very
And a lot of
cool.
folk Catholicism. A lot of folk Catholicism.
That's so common. That is
Yep.
so common with people from the South. It's very, very common.
It is a little bit.
You know what? I often feel like kind of a weirdo. My my family was never well, my parents just weren't into pushing religion on people, whatever.
Hmm.
But we were never baptized or anything. We didn't go to church. And I just think that folk Catholicism in any sort of magical context, I think it's just the most interesting and beautiful and like wild type of magic I've ever seen because it's like so different from the witchcraft I'm used to.
Hmm.
I love the folk Catholicism. I love how positive you were about things like folk Catholicism and Christianity throughout your book.
Well, thanks. I mean, it's really hard to divorce the history of witchcraft from those influences, for better or worse. I do think it's possible for people to interact with magic without necessarily like coming from a Christian framework. I think it would be
Yeah.
ridiculous to say otherwise because so many cultures have had magic. But if you're talking about North American folk magic and folk witchcraft, there's going to be places where it touches on the influence of those things, whether that's the use of the Psalms and the practices, or funnily enough, the fact that there's so much lore about the devil, and that's actually something. It's been really funny for all of the kind of responses people have given. There's definitely a lot of people who kind of react to the book, and they're like, "I really enjoy this book. There's a lot more devil in this book than I thought there was going to be," and it's kind of like, well. He shows up a lot. I don't know what to tell you. He's just
He
part of the
shows
story.
up a lot. That was another thing I was going to bring up.
Yeah, he's around. He gets around. But it's crucial, like, to understand, like, we're not talking about like arch enemy Satan of the sort of the big cosmological devil kind of thing that people think of. We're talking
Yeah.
about a very local, very intimate kind of like.
Devil
Kind of
went
a
down to
jackass.
Georgia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's gonna get you in a fiddle contest, maybe.
Right. Yeah, he's more of like he always feels like more of a trickster god
Yeah,
in
yeah,
our like North American folktale. Like he's more about fucking with people than he is about doing real evil, right?
yeah, yeah. Well,
Super
and the other,
interesting.
yeah, and the other side of that is, he's tricking people, and we do see him doing like all this kind of tricking, and he always seems like he's the bad guy, but he almost always gets beaten. Whatever he's doing, he's almost always
Yeah.
beaten in his own game. And so my thing is like, if he's that easy to beat, if he's constantly getting beaten, he's not much of a threat. But
Yeah.
I wonder how much of this is really, him as a sort of trickster initiator, sort of putting you through the paces to
Yeah.
sort of make you think around a problem in a new way, as sort of a game that he's playing with you. In which case, he. I'm not saying that he's the best teacher in the world, but he's got his method. He has a pedagogy he's using, I guess.
He definitely does. He has some, agreed upon themes and iconography for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he's super popular here. We love him.
Yeah.
We love Satan in America. We're all about him. How strange is that this like really evangelical country is just so full of Satan. Wonderful,
Yep.
wonderful. Actually, I really I loved the bits about the Pennsylvania Dutch practice in your book because that is one that I'm completely unfamiliar with. It is so interesting. What are some of the big differences that you see between the Southern conjure that you grew up with and the Pennsylvania Dutch, the powwow and the hexes that you are around now?
Well, I mean, the linguistic differences are going to be huge
Yeah.
in some ways because the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, it is German. It should be very clear. Dutch is an epithet that people have sort of piled on top of them, and most of the time
Yeah.
they adopt it kind of gleefully here because they know that it's wrong, and it sort of makes it delights them. Like, oh, look how stupid they are for continuing to call us
Right.
this. Um, but at the same time, so there's this very specific sort of Germanic dialect, and there's a good bit of that seems to work itself into the charms. The charms very much do derive from some of the sort of German antecedents, and you also have an interesting kind of influx of the sort of printed tradition of folk magic, just because there were a lot of German language almanacs and broadsides and newspapers and things like that were being
Very
printed
cool.
here. Yeah, and so a lot of that winds up, you have a lot of kind of folk astrology that winds up there, and you do have that in Southern Conjure too, but there's just slightly different applications of it.
Right.
Um, and you also have some like there's a lot of stuff pulling from like the Albertus Magnus or the Romanus Bookline, these sort of Germanic language grimoire texts that
Very
were
cool.
translated and then wind up over here, kind of among the Pennsylvania Dutch, that are used in some interesting ways, but they're not, you know, it's you can still find some of that in Southern Conjure, but it's just a little heavier here. And there's also some, I mean, they have a really good sense of humor here too. Not that Southern Conjurers don't either, but the humor is very, very,
I'm sure
um,
it's different.
it's very gleeful, very tongue in cheek, and you have
Cute.
to know when jokes being made at your expense.
I love that. I
Yeah,
see, and if I know, I can totally roll with that.
yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah, this is it's so regional.
Mhm.
It's such a small area of magic that it's just so interesting to see an entire system of magic that only exists in this one teeny tiny little place.
Hmm.
Um,
Mhm.
how different is it to some like lingering German folk magic that you might still see in actual Germany?
I mean, I think it's one of those situations where people practicing some of the Pennsylvania Dutch practices would probably look back and see somebody doing something in sort of a German folk practice and say, I can see the similarities, whereas people in the from the German side of that might not see it. Like I think the awareness is a little more one sided. Um, that's not to say that the people practicing the German folk magic are unaware. I just think that what they might see a Pennsylvania German person doing is going to be a little. It's a little more. Mm, as much as I said it was sort of a literary thing. Um, it's devolved out of the literary tradition in some ways here too, and added in some new components and some new sort of folk charms and things like that. So you have a lot of kind of um, folk phraseology and folk, um, linguistic charms that have sort of
Yeah.
changed over time. And so they feel a little different. They sound a little different. And then there's, also the influence of, one of the things that we see among the Pennsylvania Dutch. I don't know if you've ever seen Pennsylvania German architecture, but like a lot of times they have two front doors.
Yeah.
They're kind of side by side to each other. And that was, it was one of those things where it was very common for the architecture here to have that, but a lot of the British neighbors were like, "Why do you have two front doors?" And so there was some accommodation of that, right, where they started to change the way they were designing their houses at times
Mm.
to reflect that British influence because they were trying to kind of merge in and blend in, and so they started to pick up some of the British techniques in their practices too, and some of their magical practices. And it should be noted, a lot of the Pennsylvania German settlers were kind of on the leading edge of colonization, along where they were kind of interacting with the Susquehannock
Yeah.
tribes, the Lenape tribes, and so they were picking up some of the information from those tribes, and incorporating that into their practices long before the British were. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's another kind of thread that I saw woven throughout the book is different, types of American folk magic, how that close proximity to, the different indigenous tribes we have here, how that kind of how they blended, how they
Hmm.
came together, and how you still see a lot of native practices that people might not realize came from indigenous people in their
Sure.
local practices. That's so interesting. That's such a, I think that's something that makes North American magic so special,
Hmm.
is like this. Obviously colonization was not special, it was not
No.
fantastic, but but
Right.
it has left us with this very interesting blend of cultures throughout this part of the world. It's one of the
Yeah.
things I like best about this part of the world.
Sure. Right. No, and there are a lot of indigenous traditions that do wind up sort of connected to to the practices that we see. It's funny because there are different relationships kind of among different tribes with different sort of European groups and different groups kind of in the areas where they're settling. I remember being at it was a Pennsylvania German. It's called Hintfest, which is this kind of like harvest festival type thing at a sort of historical Pennsylvania German farm near where I teach. And it was great. It was really, really wonderful. And I wound up, there was actually a Lenore Lenape representative there of the indigenous tribes that was there. And I wound up sitting and talking to him for quite a while and hearing, he was just eager to sort of tell the story of his tribe and his people. And this was the space where he could do it because he knew people would be interested in this kind of folk framework of this harvest festival among the Pennsylvania Germans, right?
Yeah.
So there is an interesting, there are places where there's some really interesting accommodations and overlap and where you can see like the Lenape and the Pennsylvania Germans seem to get along better than you might see in other places where European displacement and colonization, sort of an imperialism, have done a
Yeah.
different level of damage and destruction. Like when you get into kind of the Seelige and the Creek and the Muskogee Cree tribes in kind of the area where I grew up, that's the Trail of Tears, and so
Yeah.
very different in that
Yeah,
space.
they're not looking to make friends, not necessarily. That wasn't
Right, like
that
it's
wasn't
a
really
very,
the priority there.
yeah, very conflicted in that space.
Yeah, I noticed that the few little like folk practices that I encountered in Atlantic Canada with
Hmm.
the Acadian French out there,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
much of with it, there was a lot of going back and forth between there and Louisiana, right? The whole
Sure.
Louisiana Purchase, etc. Uh, all of that. Um, that was also very connected with the people who had been living there forever. Whereas on the West Coast, where you see a lot more damage being done to the native and indigenous people, like in Vancouver,
Hmm.
it was not. There's no sort of seamless transition. There's no transition at all. It's still a huge clash, and indigenous people are treated so awfully out there,
Hmm.
um, and as so other, so different. And I noticed that none of the witches I met, none of them had any sort of connection to any indigenous magic from there at all.
Hmm.
In fact, many of them were druids, which I thought was funny because it's
Hmm.
trees everywhere, right? Beautiful.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That makes
Makes
sense.
total sense. But there was absolutely no like Native American magic in the regular practices. So interesting.
It is, and I mean, in one way, on the one hand, there's an element where you go like, well, there's some respect there because you wouldn't want to co-opt or
Right.
steal from those tribes, just because you happen to be in an area where you might have Shoshone influences or something like that, or Tlingit influences. That's not necessarily meaning that you should immediately sort of start adopting those things without talking to the people who are involved in those tribes.
Yeah, please don't do that, people. If you're listening,
No, that's a terrible
please
idea.
don't.
But it is interesting, like you made the point about them being druids and kind of connecting with the trees, and it's really important to understand that, to connect with those trees is also to connect with the history of the people who have been managing those trees. If you're up there in the Pacific Northwest, you're probably dealing with the Columbia River, because it's just such a central river to that part of the world.
Yeah.
And there have been long-standing conflicts with indigenous rights on that river, and for example, fishing rights on that river, and,
Yeah.
and the sort of damming of that river and the control of that river. And so, if you're a druid working with that river, it would really behoove you to understand that long-standing history and conflict, and probably to see where can you be of service to the people
Yeah.
who were of service to those trees and to that river for so long. And
Absolutely.
I'm not saying you have to go out and do this. I'm just saying certainly wouldn't hurt for you to think about that and maybe consider it as a part of the practice, right?
Right. See if there's some way that you can learn more, some way you can contribute,
Yeah.
Maybe you just aren't seeing this stuff because it's not in your, it's not really looking for you. It's not in your perspective. Maybe you have to look around a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, the
Yeah.
Columbia River. I lived right near it and it was such a shame.
Mhm.
It's used for the logging and it's just,
Yeah.
it's so dark that you can't see down, but it's not, it's not as deep as it looks. It was
It's
sad.
heartbreaking when you think about like the people discussing what it was like to kind of and this is the European perspective, but like the Europeans kind of first coming there and sort of the almost sort of sense that like you couldn't go down the river without catching fish, basically, right? Like they would just
Hmm.
jump in the boat. It was so abundant, and like now the indigenous tribes that try to fish that river run into all kinds of legal complications when they try to exercise fishing rights that were given to them by treaty. Like they have these
Yeah.
rights.
For like a really long time. Like they've had these rights a long time. I know Atlantic Canada, we had a big problem with this just recently. And it
Oh
was
yeah.
it's like, I know that people are racist and I know that Indigenous racism is a problem in Canada, but like
Mhm.
seeing average people just screaming obscenities at Native people just for fishing
Right.
was so, it was so eye-opening, so upsetting. Like how like
Yeah.
how can you get upset about this? This is literally something they've had the right to do since long before any of our ancestors got here. Like
Yeah.
I can't make that connection in my brain.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I get like for some of them, there really is a feeling of like, their livelihood is at stake, but there also has to be an understanding that like, that's the same problem that the indigenous people are facing. And the real, if you're going to be screaming at somebody, maybe be screaming at all the people who have exploited the fishing rights and the fishing trade for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
People who are in power, even maybe the political figures who are, making these things as complicated as they are. So
Right? Those are like waters where there's commercial fishing. Like
yeah,
like
yeah,
single fishing boats are not going to come anywhere close to commercial fishing.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
we're kind of looking in the wrong direction here.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
So is there kind of an interesting folk magic from a region, from anywhere, in North America that you could only scratch the surface of and are, looking to learn more about?
Oh, I'll tell you. I mean, I'm constantly looking to learn more about so many things. I've recently bumped into some folks who we're going to have on the show who have opened up this whole world of French Canadian sorcellerie,
Yes.
which is very much kind of rooted in this area that you're talking about. The Acadian side of it is part of it, but there's this whole other complex of groups that it really had this deep sort of French French-influenced folk magical practice that was very much shaped by the environment up there.
My God, I'm so excited
Amazing.
for that.
Yeah, no, it's so great. They have a website and stuff like that that I'll send over to you so you can take a look at it. But it's really fascinating.
I'm
and then
very excited.
well, yeah, and the other side of it is I stayed very much clear of a lot of Asian American magic, which mostly comes from the fact that I just don't have a lot of resources on it, and I don't have a lot of inroads into those communities, and so I could only do the most cursory glances of things there. And I've made some connections over time with people who practice various forms of Asian American. So there's Korean shamanism. There's Hmong shamanism. I've gotten to know some other folks who do Taoist sorcery and things like that, and so that's been nice. But I still don't have a lot of depth on any of that, and so I really want to know more about those practices and traditions. But I also know that I would never be the person to write that book.
Right. It's like, I really want someone else to write this book for me. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Somebody who's within those communities they need to write those books.
Yeah. Cause I would certainly read those books.
Yes,
I would
exactly.
absolutely read that book.
Very much. I would love to know more, but I do not want to.
I don't want to intrude. I don't want to be that person. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's man, imagine just living in a world where you don't care and you just barge in and write books about that. I can't imagine that now. But that used to happen all the time.
Hello, every white man.
Ever before the last 4 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so crazy to me now.
Oh, man.
Well, I'm very excited about these Canadians because that is, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, I really need a book like this about Canada because I'm convinced there is some really interesting stuff to find. And we also have a lot of different cultures throughout, coast to coast and all the way up north.
Yeah, you really do. Yeah.
Yeah, Canada's really neat, America. You can look into it.
It is, and I tried to get a little bit of Canadian lore into the book, but it really was limited to a lot of kind of maritime traditions and things that kind of came up through sort of discussing practices that had also been in the United States or what became the United States for a while too. And so I didn't get nearly as deep into sort of the Canadian lore as I wanted to. I do mention Ogopogo, who I really love. It's out there in Western Canada. But, it really, there's so much more that could be explored in Canada. There's so much more that could be explored in Mexico and Central America.
I'd also read those books.
There's some good ones coming out. There's one called American Brujeria by J. Allen Cross that focuses on kind of the North American, I say North American, the really kind of United States and Canadian, to some extent, interpretations of sort of traditional Mexican brujeria. So I highly recommend that one. But
yeah, that's at the top of my to read list. Where
it's great.
I know we're planning to read it as a book club pick in my book club because it's something we all want to learn more about. Yeah. I'm really excited about that.
It's great. It's really, really good. So
cool. Okay. This was actually a really super good lead in because I have it's a strange little story from where I live. So I live in Windsor, Ontario, which is right across the Detroit River from Detroit. So that's kind of where I'm at. And, in 2019, my friend who is French Canadian, she was working on this project to go through and translate and sort some of these old French newspapers and magazines that came out of some of the smaller towns and cities that became Windsor.
Mm-hmm.
So one of these places is Walkerville, which is a neighborhood of Windsor now, but it was a city at the time. So what she found was a story called The Witches of Walkerville, a family forced out of the village, right? Beautiful title.
Oh, yeah.
So it's very short, but in the village of Walkerville, they still believe in warlocks and witches. A poor family by the name of Nantes just lived through a sad experience. It was a couple days. The children of said Nantes were suddenly sick with something strange. The children were following each other in the field and shouting strange cries, and nothing would calm them. Convinced that a spell was cast upon their children, Nantes and his wife went looking for the warlock or witch who they accused of the sacrilege. They began by stabbing a pillow that they believe housed the cast spell. However, there was nothing in the pillow besides feathers. But by the next morning, they remarked a poor young woman from the neighborhood slept slept the unsocial social character. Some of this is hard to translate because French
Mm-hmm.
has changed a lot. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So she was a miserable woman is kind of what they found. And that she had a very large gash on her head.
Mm-hmm.
It was a sign from the farmers that she was the witch, and the knife which cut the pillow had caused the injury they discovered. The witch was not burnt alive like they used to do, but the poor woman, her husband, and their children were forced out of the village, and they can never return. Because since the departure, the Nantes children have stopped running and screaming, and nothing will convince the good people of Walkerville otherwise that they were bewitched by their neighbor.
Mm.
So this sounds like a lot of witch trial stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's really super bizarre about this is that this happened in the 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe even the early 1900s. So that's like a couple hundred years after
Right.
regular
So,
witch trials were like normal in North America. And we've never been able to find anything else about this. And it never tells you the family of the witches. And it was just a little tiny column, like nothing else about this ever.
Mm.
But what I thought was really, really interesting is the stabbing a pillow that they believed housed the cast spell. Was this like a kind of common method of housing spells or spelling things to get them to other people? Like, did people regularly curse pillows or things like that?
I mean, you would want to. I mean, the witches would want to curse something that would be intimate to the family that could impact them. But there actually sounds a little bit like there's a phenomenon called a feather crown, which would sometimes form in a pillow, where it would form almost like a little nest-like shape or a little circular shape, and it looked like a little crown of feathers. They said that if you find one in your pillow, that it was a bad omen and that you were, potentially going to become sick or die. And it wouldn't be surprising to sort of think of her as, witches have very strong connections to various birds and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And so it wouldn't be surprising if she'd, sort of planted this sort of feather crown in the pillow. And what really strikes me is that you've got the sympathetic magic of the pillow being stabbed and then her manifesting the symptoms the next day, which is very common in witch lore. People will lose a limb and then, they have an injury to that limb the next day or something like that.
Yeah.
And also interesting, they said that it was a cut on her forehead. And that's usually, if you can scratch a witch across her forehead and make her bleed across her forehead, she loses all power over you in a lot of North American lore. So
That's
the fact that they kind of, right, exactly. So it kind of hits multiple notes, even though it's a very brief little piece. There's multiple notes of American or of sort of traditional witch lore in there. And her being forced out reminds me a lot. There's a witch named Maul Dyer in Maryland who was forced out and left her handprints on a rock in the woods where she died. So that kind of like, expelling from the town. And I think that happened in the 19th century as well. So this is not an unusual phenomenon.
Because that was my next question was were there still a lot of fears about witches, like right in the 1880s, early 1900s, right at the turn of the century there? Was that still a big problem?
Oh, I mean, there's still fear of witches in various parts of our world. But even in North America, there's still a lot of discussion about witches and evil eye and things like that, just depending on the community you're in. But in the 19th century, for sure, even in the 20th century, where you're talking about the Pennsylvania German region, there was a very, very famous, it was called the Hex Murder Trial, where in, I believe it was around the 1920s or early 30s.
Whoa.
Moving really, really far in here, there was a man who was murdered by some of his neighbors because they believed that he had been using his braucherei, his hexerei, I'm sorry, sort of his power of witchcraft to curse them. It was weird. The people who killed him were also practicing that magic and had actually consulted a local witch to find out who it was that was doing all this. They originally intended to just break in and steal this guy's books, but they wound up tying him to a chair and beating him, and then they killed him and set him on fire, basically, is what it kind of came down to.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. Brutal stuff, but this is it's a well-documented story. Really did happen. The guy did get arrested, spent some time in jail, eventually got out. So very, very real
Did he just go
stories.
on to live a normal life? Like,
I mean,
wow.
he'd spent 20 years in jail and had, I think, intensive psychological counseling by that point. But yeah, it
Good
was,
for him. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there was a lot of tragedy around that. And the Pennsylvania German community felt very embarrassed by this because they didn't like the eyes of the world being on them and people saying like, oh, look how superstitious they are. Because
Right.
when in truth, if you turn that lens around on any community, there were people doing that. I mean, look at, even in the Appalachian Mountains, you have a lot of people who participate in these kind of Pentecostal, um, you know, faith-based, charismatic religious things where they're speaking in tongues or, maybe even handling serpents in some churches and things like
Yeah.
that.
So cool. So
Very
interesting.
folk magical stuff. And they will 100% tell you, oh yeah, there's witchcraft. Yeah, we're not doing that. We're doing something else. But
Right.
yeah, there's definitely witchcraft out there. So,
They may be speaking in tongue and using snakes, but it's not the same.
right. No, totally different. And they will fight you tooth and nail on that too. But yeah, and it is interesting. It's, they'll say, yeah, there is witchcraft. That's not what we're doing, but there is witchcraft and here's how we counteract that. So
It is so interesting. Using magic to counteract magic.
always the way it goes.
That is, wow. Like, to me, it just seems so wild that anyone, in the 1900s, in the 1920s and 30s
Yeah.
could still be, burning witches alive or running them out of town or what have you. Like, that's just, it feels so much more normal for the 1690s than it does for any time near our own century.
Yeah. No, I mean, it feels like it belongs to that bygone era of
Right.
Salem trials and then 1700s. But I mean, if you think about it, Nathaniel Hawthorne is dealing with sort of his inherited legacy of the Salem witch trials by writing the Scarlet Letter and a whole bunch of other stories that are very like witch centered in the 1850s. So
True
it's
that.
not surprising people have it on their brain. You get into the 20th century, mid 20th century, Arthur Miller writes The Crucible to recap. He's dealing with the McCarthy era,
Yeah.
witch hunts, so-called witch hunts for communism, but using witch trials as a framework. And so there's that. And then the Satanic Panic in the late 20th century. People are accusing people of witchcraft all over the place with that. So,
And that's something that just kind of flares back up and goes back down to sleep, I feel, on a kind of regular basis.
yeah.
I feel like even in the non-Christian magical communities, I constantly see just rebranded Satanic Panic about darkness or holding in darkness and it's really frustrating. It's really frustrating. Yeah. That's another thing that feels like I thought we left this behind. Yeah, that's sad. Well, fortunately, your book is full of incredibly cool stories, incredibly interesting differences throughout the magic of North America. I know North America is huge, but it really is just one corner of the world. And I love seeing how different it is all over the place and where all that came from.
Well, thanks. I agree. I love seeing that too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you do. Yeah, this is really interesting. What is the exact date that the book is coming out? The release date?
So it just came out on April 8th.
Oh, that's right. Perfect.
So it just got released. It's just made its way into the world, winging its
yeah.
It's very, very heavy tome kind of around the world. So
you know what? Everybody needs something to read right now.
They sure do. Right?
Everybody needs something to read right now. So a nice big heavy tome full of stories and some real magical practices that you can totally use right now. Like as I'm scrolling, I'm looking at automatic writing and working with a pendulum, which we still totally do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think everybody needs that right now. It's a good time for it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that this book will spark people's interest in experimenting with some magic and looking in their own backyard for things that they may not have known to look for. So
yeah, absolutely. It's there's so much magic all over here. In the beginning of your book, you mentioned feeling like the magic you encountered in Eastern Europe, it existed all the way over there and you were far away from it now. and discovering that, there is different but similar magic here. That is such a beautiful sentiment to, feel that connected thread all the way across the ocean like that.
Mm.
Especially in Eastern European folk magic, some of the things you listed, like the using the wedding rings on a gold chain to discover the sex of a baby.
Sure.
I've never seen that be wrong. I was a doula for a while, and that was right 100% of the time. Some of the Polish ladies I knew didn't even need the rings. They could just tell you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, the rings are just the prop, right? Like at that point, they're like, no, we know.
Very cool and spooky. Like, just, I've never forgotten that, because that is such a cool, spooky, that is such a cool, spooky thing. Very cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, midwives and doulas have so much great magical lore. I mean,
I was excited to see that you had a whole section on, midwives and their kind of place in our folklore, because it's so true.
Yeah, they really do.
Yeah. Even in Canada, we had, a resurgence like 10 years back of interest in midwifery and being a doula.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that Canada was full of midwives and doulas, just absolutely full of them. And we've been finding more and more, notes and recipes and things in the last 10 to 15 years from around here that no one really thought was interesting before.
Yeah. I mean, and there's so much, I mean, people don't understand how deeply ingrained in communities midwives often are.
Yeah.
And how much knowledge they wind up with access to. One of my favorite kind of scholarly books is this book called The Diary of Martha Ballard, which is 18th century midwife's diary. And it's amazing. Like she's obviously chronicling births and deaths, but she's also chronicling like family drama, family strife that's going on, conflicts, but not like in a judgmental way, but kind of like just providing you a window on the community that shows that she was in everybody's business and wasn't like the drama queen of it, right? Like she's not like stirring up trouble. It's not Real Housewives of the Prairie or anything. But she just knew so much stuff, and also, bore a lot of practical knowledge about, herbs and things like that, but practical knowledge about, dealing with, safety issues and things like that. Just all kinds of interesting stuff there. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was, thank you for including that in that book. I really appreciate that. Oftentimes, I notice that man writers sometimes will kind of ignore sort of some of history that women have really claimed as our own. Oftentimes it gets left out. So I was very excited to see that in there.
Oh, well, I wish there were more of it in there, honestly.
Yeah. You know what? That's another thing I could read a whole other book about. So, so maybe one day,
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. If you're writing that book, I'll read it. Anyone out there? Just to let you know. So those were the questions I had for you today. Is there anything else that you want to say about New World Witchery, the book, or the podcast that you want people to know?
I mean, first of all, I'm just super grateful that to the people who have been so supportive in getting this book out there and making this book happen. And also honestly, one of the things I'm really, really impressed by is the community of people who have formed around kind of modern witchcraft that also have this interest in folk magic. Because like I said, your recent episodes where you're kind of exploring folk magic, I've just been like, yes, this is so great. And we have so many other really interesting people kind of emerging on the scene. In the generation, I don't know. They're probably actually in your generation, but I feel like an old man now. So.
I'm an older millennial. They're all children. They all feel like children to me.
Yes, the younger millennial and elder Zs, I guess, at this point, are kind of, but they're putting out really interesting, really thoughtful stuff. People are actually making this effort to work through some of the difficult problems and not just whitewash everything.
Yeah.
There's a lot more native and indigenous and people of color that are actually coming to the forefront and sharing their traditions. And I'm so thrilled to see that happening right now.
Absolutely.
So thank you for being a part of that too. So.
Yeah, I do what I can. I would love to do more. You are my first guest of this year, and I'm realizing it's April right now and how strange that is. And all day as I was kind of getting ready, I was like, I gotta do more of this. I can't believe it's April. So hopefully I'll find some more people to share their own kind of personal folk magic.
I hope so. Yeah, there's a lot of them out there that would be, I think, thrilled to come on the show and talk about this with you, because you're just a delight to talk to too. So.
Oh, thanks. You know what? I never imagined I would like doing interviews, because theoretically I don't like people. It's like I love people, but not necessarily. I can't explain it, but I love being able to talk to other people and getting their perspective on witchcraft. And I really loved your book, and I really related to it, especially every mention of like the Wizard of Oz and how that is like our fairy tale here. It's so true.
It really is. It's our national fairy tale in some ways.
It absolutely is. It is a purely North American fairy tale. So beautiful. I loved the book. Thank you so much for writing it and for coming on and talking with us today. This is excellent.
Well, thank you, Paige. I really appreciated it. And I hope, people will check out the book, and I hope people will keep listening to your show and keep encouraging you to do folk magic and do folk magic themselves. So
yeah, let's all do folk magic. Let's all just do some folk magic.
That's right. That's it.
That's all we're going to do now.
Yep.
Thank you so much to Cory Thomas Hutcheson, as it says on the cover of this beautiful new book, for coming on the show. It is honestly such a delight to talk to him. If you enjoyed his voice and his wonderful storytelling, please check out his podcast, New World Witchery, while you wait for the book to arrive, as I'm sure you've already ordered it. After we recorded this episode, my head was buzzing with the little clues that Cory gave me about my local witchy story, my Witches of Walkerville story. So I did a little bit of research on the folk customs that Cory mentioned. So the point of the story that really stood out was, this pillow. The family of the afflicted children used sympathetic magic to break the curse by cutting open a feather pillow. The next day, a woman who was not well liked had a gash on her forehead. That's what sympathetic magic means. You are taking an action against a certain item that represents the person that you are actually trying to reach, and it forms a connection. So this woman who was not well liked had a gash on her forehead the next day, and this was seen as proof that she was a witch and that she had cursed this other family. So what's with the pillow? Cory mentioned a custom called a crown of feathers, and I found that in other places it's also called a death wreath or a witch wreath. Very fun. So if someone is ill or on their deathbed, you should slice open their pillow, or sometimes their mattress. It's a feather pillow. And look for what appears to be a wreath of feathers all woven and like matted together. The wreath should be removed, doused in salt, burned, or otherwise destroyed to break the curse. This was most common in the Appalachian Mountains and in their folk customs. And before that, it was a mainly German custom. The Appalachian Mountains are not the only place where we have German immigrants. All throughout the Midwest, we have a lot of German immigrants, where I live included. So I'm not surprised that that particular, idea or custom might have made it up here. And if that would be the reason they were focused so much on the pillow specifically. So then we have the gash on her forehead, the witch's forehead, right? Other than it being, just a startling coincidence, why was it significant that it's up there? This actually comes from Scottish folklore and is referred to as cutting above the breath. So in the Highlands of Scotland, it was believed that to neutralize a witch's power, you had to cut her above the eyes, or, above the breath, and draw blood, usually with a pin or a needle, and then keep that as a protective talisman. So I found this little spell for cutting above the breath. Take a silver pin, conceal it between the fingers of the thumb and the left hand. Try to meet the witch in the morning. Pass her on the right side. In passing, draw blood from above the eyes. Keep the pin covered with blood, and the witch has no power over you. Of course, that was never a super good thing to do. You shouldn't be scratching people left and right. But of course, some people took it way, way, way too far and actually held women down and cut up their faces to try to neutralize their witchcraft. And this was totally still happening in the 1880s in Scotland and in North America by, some Scottish immigrants or descendants. And again, we have quite a few where I live. as well. And as you can tell by the city name of Windsor, this was more of a, British Isles populated area than a specifically French one, until you drive about 20 to 30 minutes away by car, of course. But anywho, so we have a lot of, Scottish and German people who have been here for a super long time. So I'm wondering if that's how these particular little practices ended up here in Walkerville, now Windsor. Now, Scottish and German heritage, those are two of the biggest influences on Appalachian magic. So I am not surprised to see them combined in this way. This is just another connection between where I live in the South. Where I live in Canada, there is just this, it's like this just very invisible thread that goes straight from here where we are to the southern United States. And there's just so much in common in a bunch of different ways, food-wise, magic-wise, just some general cultural things-wise, even weather-wise. It's just something that I've always noticed. But anyways, as far as we know, the people in this story were not Scottish or German. They were French, very French. The family who was afflicted, their last name is spelled Nantes, Nantais. And there are, just hundreds of people just in Windsor alone with this last name, all with different pronunciations, which is why I'm saying it phonetically instead of any of the million pronunciations. But we still have a lot of people with this last name here in town, and they are still very, very French Canadian. Very interesting, right? I cannot wait to find out more. I'm really pumped. I'm really pumped to have just a little bit more of the story to kind of go for. It's just all I have is this short little newspaper column from sometime in the 1880s, so that's a whole 10 years. And it's The Witches of Walkerville, a family forced out of a village. But in French, of course, and I'm not going to bastardize it for you. I think I've killed French enough on this show. So all I have is this tiny bit of information, and I'm pretty grateful to have just a little bit more to go off of. I can't wait for the library and the museum to open back up so I can, start digging around. Maybe I can even track down, the name of the family that was forced out. Or even the specific French-Canadian family from this story who probably still have descendants living here in the city. So hopefully I will have enough information to tell you all the whole story someday. I'm really excited. Thanks for the help, Cory. I really appreciate it. So that is all I have for you today, witches. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to grab a copy of New World Witchery by Cory Hutcheson, which was released April 8th. I have the links in the description of the episode to where you can get a copy if you are in Canada or the US. I hope all of you witches have a wonderful week and a very magical full moon in Scorpio, which is coming up on Monday, the 26th of April. If you celebrate Beltane or May Day on May 1st, I hope it's very fiery, fun, and full of fairy magic. To learn more about me or the Fat Feminist Witch podcast, check out my website at thefatfeministwitch.com or find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. If you like the content here on the show and you want a little bit more, check out my books Green Witchcraft and The Grimoire Journal. Both books are written for witches of all skill levels to help you begin a relationship with the planet, deepen the one you already have, and craft a very personal, magical practice. If you want to support the show, you can make a donation by going to my website and clicking the button that says Buy Me a Coffee, or you can join my private monthly membership group at patreon.com/thefatfeministwitch. For years, you wonderful, die-hard listeners of the Fat Feminist Witch have been asking me where you can get t-shirts, bags, and other swag to represent your love of the Fat Feminist Witch. And I'm so excited to finally tell you that I have Fat Feminist Witch merch or swag, whatever you like to call it, now available from TeePublic. You can get t-shirts that feature the podcast logo, great phrases like ranting, raving, and wand waving, and even little jokes about your extensive witchy book collection. I've got tote bags, t-shirts, custom notebooks, and all sorts of designs I'm adding to and updating all the time. So check out the link in the description for my new TeePublic store where you can get Fat Feminist Witch podcast swag. When you get it, please take a picture and tag me anywhere on social media. I can't wait to see how great you guys look in it. If you have a witchy product, service, or publication and you want to reach a magical audience, you can advertise here on the show. Just go to advertisecast.com/thefatfeministwitch to get started.